Welcome to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you have a story you would like to share, please email it to me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading 3 to 5 times every week. So please leave town with the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. This story is about the ghost town of Portlock, Alaska, and the events that led to the entire town fleeing in the early 1950s. Portlock is located at the very southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, and it got its name from a British ship captain by the name of Nathaniel Portlock, who discovered that area in 1786. After the area was discovered, it slowly grew into a settlement that was mostly comprised of Russian Aleuts. That settlement grew into more of a town over time, and come the 1900s, they had a cannery because of all the salmon in the area. Logging was also another really big trade in that area as well. And come 1921, the town had gotten so big that the U.S. Postal Service actually ended up opening a post office there in Portlock. Everything was going good in Portlock till around the 1930s. Come the 1930s, really weird things started happening around town to all the townspeople. People were going missing, they were hearing screams in the woods at all hours of the day, and people started seeing things. The locals started blaming all of these events on what they called the Natinak, which is very similar to Bigfoot or Sasquatch. They described the Natinak as being a very large bipedal creature, about 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and just being really, really powerful. The first event that actually happened in the area that made the townspeople realize that something just was not right about this place was when a group of Dall sheep hunters headed up into the hills one day to go Dall sheep hunting. So these hunters, they left town, they headed up into the hills, and they did not come back that night. So the next day, the town organized a search party, and they went up into the hills the same way the Dall sheep hunters went to go look for these hunters. They didn't find any trace of them. The only thing they actually found was one bow, and it was swinging from a tree, and that was it. Well, 3 weeks later, however, at a small lagoon just outside of town, these hunters' bodies and parts of their bodies ended up washing ashore in this lagoon. So the townspeople ended up retrieving the bodies and retrieving the body parts, and they brought them back to town. And they brought him to a doctor, and this doctor just happened to be a specialist in when it came to animal attacks. So this doctor looked at the bodies, looked at the body parts, and he determined that these wounds were not consistent with a bear attack, a cat attack, or even wolves. He said that the limbs looked like they had been pulled from the bodies versus being ripped from the bodies, which would be what would be expected if it was a bear, a cat, or a pack of wolves. So this made the townspeople really nervous, and all the loggers in the area actually ended up refusing to go to work. They were scared. They didn't want to go up into those woods where these hunters went and never came back except for their dead bodies and their body parts. So there was this one guy, and his name was Andrew Camlock. He was a logger, and he actually owned his own logging company. Just like all the other logging companies, his employees refused to come to work because they were scared. So this one day, Andrew went out into the woods by himself to go logging, and he never came back that night. So the next day, the town assembled a search party, and the search party went into the woods to go look for Andrew. They ended up finding Andrew, and he was lying face down in the dirt, and the back of his head had been crushed in. And about 15 feet from him, there was this big piece of logging equipment that they would use to strip the bark off the logs that they had harvested. And right on the handle was a big blood mark. And they said that it almost looked like something had picked this piece of equipment up and used it as a club to hit Andrew in the back of the head. So now people were even more scared. And all the employees at the cannery ended up refusing to go to work too. So what the cannery did to try to get the employees to feel safe and try to get them to come back to work was they ended up hiring armed guards to kind of patrol the area, walk the perimeter of the cannery to try to make them feel safe. Unfortunately, that did not work, and the cannery ended up closing down. There was another man, and his name was Albert Petka. And Albert lived on a houseboat on the Yukon River, which wasn't too far out of town. And one day there was a couple of hunters were out and they spotted Albert's boat, but it was quite a few miles downstream from where it would normally be. So the hunters approached the boat, and as they were getting closer, they saw that the whole outside of the boat was covered in blood. So these two hunters ended up boarding onto the boat, and they found Albert, and his body was all banged up. He was knocking on death's door at this point. So they asked Albert what happened. And Albert's last words to them was a description of exactly what had happened to him. And apparently, he was in his houseboat one night and he heard a noise outside. So he grabbed his rifle and he went outside and he ended up seeing a Natinak. And by the time he raised his rifle, this thing was on him and it grabbed him, threw him to the ground, picked him up, and started beating him against the side of his boat. Albert ended up dying shortly thereafter. So now people in town were even more scared, and the screams from the woods continued at night. More people started going missing, and a lot more weird stuff was happening. Houses would have rocks thrown at them, and the people were just terrified. And come 1950 to 1951, all of the people in town, because they had enough of dealing with this, and they were all so scared, the entire town actually ended up fleeing Portlock and going to nearby communities. And for the last while that the town had any population in it, it had one person, and that was the postmaster. The postmaster, he remained behind to close down that post office. So he would have been all alone having to deal with these creatures harassing the town, throwing rocks. But eventually, too, he ended up fleeing town once that post office was closed. Even today, there is no population in Portlock. People do go there to try to research the Natinak or Bigfoot and try to figure out exactly what happened that led these people to all flee the town. But based on historical records and accounts from the people that left, they were being harassed by these large, 8-foot tall, covered in hair bipedal creatures that were incredibly powerful that they called the Natinak. And that was why they all had fled. Well, that's it for today's story. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.